11. Jerry Garcia, 1942–1995. Jerry Garcia was the bearded, benevolent avatar of the counterculture, a guitarist whose playing wove folk, bluegrass, and psychedelia into a tapestry that defined the Grateful Dead. As the band's de facto leader, he did not just perform music. He presided over a traveling community that spanned generations. His improvisational skills were legendary, creating a unique sound that could never be perfectly replicated, much like the man himself. Songs like Truckin' and Touch of Grey became anthems for a distinct American subculture, and his influence extended far beyond the stage, touching upon art, ice cream, and the very philosophy of freedom. However, the peace and love that Garcia championed in life did not survive his death. When he passed away from a heart attack on August 9, 1995, at a rehabilitation clinic in Forest Knolls, California, he left behind a vast estate and a tangled web of relationships that would result in years of bitter litigation. The central conflict was not just about the money, though there was plenty of that. It was a battle between the different chapters of his romantic life. The legal chaos centered on a dispute between his widow, Deborah Coons Garcia, and his second wife, Carolyn Adams, famously known as Mountain Girl. Garcia and Mountain Girl had a long, complex history dating back to the Merry Pranksters era of the 1960s. They married in 1981, years after they had begun living together, and stayed married until 1994, just a year before his death. In 1993, as their marriage was dissolving, Garcia signed a one-paragraph separation agreement. In this simple-typed document, he promised to pay Mountain Girl $5 million over the course of 20 years. After Garcia died, his widow, Deborah, whom he had married in 1994, cut off these payments. She argued that the agreement was invalid, claiming Garcia was under the influence of drugs at the time and did not understand the financial implications of what he was signing. This triggered a highly publicized court battle in California. The proceedings were far from the harmonious atmosphere of a Dead show. They painted a picture of a man who, despite his immense fame, was pulled in multiple directions by the women in his life and his own battles with addiction. The judge eventually ruled in favor of Mountain Girl, upholding the settlement, but the fight exhausted the emotional reserves of everyone involved. Beyond the money, there was the matter of Garcia's final resting place, or rather, places. In his will, Garcia requested that his ashes be scattered in the Ganges River in India and the San Francisco Bay. This final wish became another logistical challenge, though it was eventually honored. Deborah took half of the ashes to India, accompanied by Bob Weir, to release them into the Holy River on April 4, 1996. The other half was scattered by his ex-wife Mountain Girl and his children near the Golden Gate Bridge. Even in death, Jerry Garcia was divided, his legacy partitioned by the courts and the geography of his loves. 10. Ike Turner, 1931–2007. Ike Turner is often remembered first for his volatility and the infamy of his personal life, but his musical achievements were foundational to the development of rock and roll. He is frequently credited with recording the first rock and roll song, Rocket 88, in 1951. His prowess as a pianist, guitarist, and bandleader was undeniable, and his work with the Kings of Rhythm shaped the sound of R&B. Later, his collaboration with Tina Turner produced high-energy hits like Proud Mary and River Deep, Mountain High, cementing his place in music history despite the dark shadow cast by his abusive behavior. When Ike Turner died of a cocaine overdose on December 12, 2007, in San Marcos, California, he left behind a musical legacy that was legally as messy as his personal reputation. He died intestate, meaning he had no valid will. For a musician with decades of royalties, copyright claims, and a Grammy-winning resurgence late in life, this was a recipe for disaster. The chaos began almost immediately. Because there was no will, the court had to determine who had the right to control his estate and his body. He had been married multiple times and had several children, all of whom had different relationships with him at the time of his death. The legal wrangling involved his children and his ex-wives, but the most significant battle emerged involving his status at the time of death. Complicating matters was the fact that Ike had a complex network of royalties. While he did not own the rights to many of the biggest hits he recorded with Tina, she had won the use of her name and independence in their divorce. He still possessed a valuable catalog of early blues and rock contributions. Furthermore, his image rights were a point of contention. His children fought over the administration of these assets, leading to a court-appointed administrator stepping in to manage the debts and assets. The situation with his grave was equally fraught. He was eventually buried at the Pacific View Memorial Park in Corona del California, but the funeral itself was a spectacle of tension. The lack of a clear directive from Ike himself meant that decisions about his service and his burial were made by committee, often resulting in disagreements among the surviving family members about how he should be honored. The legal battles over his estate dragged on, depleting much of the value that remained. His death highlighted the stark reality that for a man who controlled his bands with an iron fist, he had exercised almost no control over his own legacy, leaving it to be picked apart by lawyers and estranged relatives. 9. Barry White, 1944-2003. Barry White was the walrus of love, a man whose deep baritone voice became synonymous with romance and seduction. With hits like Can't Get Enough of Your Love, Babe, and You're the First, the Last, My Everything, he dominated the disco and soul charts of the 1970s. He was a master of orchestration, creating lush, string-heavy arrangements that provided the perfect backdrop for his distinctive vocals. His achievements included multiple Grammy Awards and a legacy as one of the best-selling music artists of all time. However, the romance that defined his music was entirely absent from the legal war that erupted after his death. Barry White died on July 4, 2003, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, following a struggle with kidney failure. The battle for his estate began even before he took his last breath. White was legally married to his second wife, Glodian White, the lead singer of the group Love Unlimited, at the time of his death. However, they had been estranged for years and lived separate lives. During his final years, White had been in a long-term relationship with a woman named Catherine Denton. This triangular dynamic set the stage for a vicious estate battle. As White lay dying in the hospital, the conflict turned physical and restrictive. Glodian, as the legal wife, exercised her rights to control his medical care and visitors. She reportedly barred Denton from seeing White in his final days, a move that created immense bitterness. After he passed, the fight moved to the courtroom. Denton claimed that she had given birth to White's child, a staggering claim that, if true, would have entitled her and the child to a significant portion of the estate. The estate, estimated to be worth nearly $20 million, hung in the balance. Glodian's lawyers demanded a paternity test for Denton's infant child. The results were shocking to Denton and decisive for the court. Barry White was not the father. The DNA test unraveled Denton's claim to the fortune. Because White had not updated his estate plan to reflect his separation from Glodian or his relationship with Denton, the legal wife held all the cards. Barry White was cremated, and his ashes were scattered by his family in the ocean off the California coast. While his final resting place is the Pacific, the courtroom records in Los Angeles remain the true monument to his end. The walrus of love left behind a lesson in the rigidity of marriage laws. Without a divorce or an updated will, the estranged spouse often wins everything, leaving the long-term partner with nothing but legal fees and grief. 8. Chris Cornell, 1964-2017. Chris Cornell possessed one of the greatest rock voices of his generation. As the frontman for Soundgarden, he helped pioneer the grunge movement that exploded out of Seattle in the 1990s. Later, he fronted Audioslave and had a successful solo career. His 4-octave vocal range and introspective, often dark songwriting on tracks like Black Hole Sun and Jesus Christ Pose earned him critical acclaim and a devoted global following. He was a sensitive artist who channeled his pain into art. His tragic death by suicide on May 18, 2017, in a Detroit hotel room shocked the world. He was 52 years old. While his fans mourned the loss of a legend, a bitter and highly public legal battle began brewing almost immediately between his widow, Vicky Cornell, and the surviving members of Soundgarden. The core of the dispute was not just money, but the ownership of the final creative output of Chris Cornell. At the time of his death, Soundgarden had been working on a new album. There were several vocal tracks that Cornell had recorded in his home studio in Florida. Vicky Cornell argued that these recordings were the sole property of Chris's estate, which she controlled, because they were recorded on his personal equipment, and there was no clear agreement stating they belonged to the band. The surviving band members, Kim Thayil, Matt Cameron, and Ben Shepherd, insisted the recordings were intended for a Soundgarden album, and that they had collaborated on the music, making them band property. The situation escalated into a federal lawsuit. Vicky sued the band, alleging they were withholding royalties from her and her children to force her to hand over the vocal tracks. The band countersued, claiming Vicky had locked them out of their own social media accounts and was damaging the band's legacy. The accusations flew back and forth for years. The band members claimed they learned of Chris's death through social media, a claim Vicky disputed. The fight over the final tapes froze the legacy of one of rock's most important bands. Fans were denied the final songs, and the dirty laundry of the band's internal business was aired in court filings. It wasn't until April 2023 that the parties finally reached an amicable out-of-court settlement, allowing the final Soundgarden recordings to eventually be released. Cornell is buried at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles. His grave, marked by a stone that simply reads, "Voice of a Generation," is a pilgrimage site for fans. However, for nearly 6 years, the silence of the grave was drowned out by the noise of the courtroom, proving that even a band built on brotherhood and shared artistic vision could be torn apart by the ambiguity of intellectual property rights after death. 7. Tom Petty, 1950–2017. Tom Petty was the quintessential American rock star, unpretentious, consistent, and endlessly talented. With the Heartbreakers, he created a songbook that is woven into the fabric of American culture, including hits like "Free Fallin'," "American Girl," and "I Won't Back Down." He was a staunch defender of artistic integrity, famously fighting his record label in the 1970s to prevent them from raising the price of his albums. He championed the rights of the artist over the corporation. It is ironic, then, that his death on October 2, 2017, sparked a corporate-style boardroom battle within his own family. Petty died of an accidental drug overdose just days after completing a massive 40th anniversary tour. He left behind a trust that was supposed to make things simple, but a single word in the document caused a firestorm. The trust appointed his widow, Dana York Petty, as the sole trustee. However, it also stipulated that his 2 daughters from his first marriage, Adria and Anakim, should have equal participation in decisions regarding his music catalog and legacy. The legal chaos hinged on the definition of equal participation. Adria and Anakim interpreted this to mean that they had 2 votes against Dana's 1, effectively giving them majority control over the estate. Dana interpreted it to mean that she, as the trustee, had the final say, but had to consult the daughters. The dispute turned nasty very quickly. The daughters sued, accusing Dana of gross mismanagement and misappropriating estate assets. Dana countersued, claiming the daughters were abusive, erratic, and making it impossible to manage the band's business. The fight stalled the release of posthumous collections and threatened to tarnish the Heartbreakers brand. Emails were leaked in court filings showing aggressive language and deep hostility. The man who wrote "It's Good to Be King" had left a kingdom in civil war. Eventually, the 3 women settled their differences, establishing a management structure that allowed them to work together to release the Wildflowers box set, a project Petty had long wanted to complete. Petty's ashes were given to family and friends, but the public monument to his death was the court docket in Los Angeles Superior Court, a testament to how even well-intentioned estate planning can fail if the family dynamic is fractured. 6. B.B. King, 1925–2015. Riley B. King, known to the world as B.B. King, was the undisputed king of the blues. He introduced a sophisticated style of soloing based on fluid string bending and shimmering vibrato that influenced virtually every electric blues guitarist who followed. With his beloved guitar, Lucille, he logged more road miles than perhaps any other musician, playing over 200 shows a year well into his 70s. He was a benevolent figure, a cultural ambassador who brought the blues from the cotton fields of Mississippi to the grandest stages in the world. When B.B. King died in his sleep on May 14, 2015, in Las Vegas at the age of 89, the sadness of the musical world was immediately interrupted by a shocking allegation. Two of his daughters, Karen Williams and Patty King, came forward with claims that their father had been murdered. The daughters alleged that King's longtime business manager, Laverne Toney, and his personal assistant had poisoned the blues legend. In affidavits filed with the court, they claimed that Toney had administered foreign substances to King to induce his death and seize control of his estate. Toney, who was named the executor of King's estate, vehemently denied the claims, calling them ridiculous and defamatory. The allegations were serious enough that the Clark County coroner took custody of King's body. An autopsy was performed, an indignity for an 89-year-old man who had died under hospice care, to rule out foul play. The results took weeks. During that time, the feud between the daughters and the estate manager intensified. The daughters had previously battled Toney in court over King's care while he was still alive, claiming he was being isolated and mistreated. Finally, the coroner released the findings. B.B. King died of natural causes, primarily Alzheimer's disease and congestive heart failure. There was no evidence of poisoning. The case was closed criminally, but the civil fighting over the estate continued. King had fathered 15 children with several different women, and the distribution of his assets was a complex logistical challenge. B.B. King was eventually returned to the Mississippi Delta. He was buried at the B.B. King Museum and Delta Interpretive Center in Indianola, Mississippi. While his funeral was a grand, soulful celebration of his life, the weeks preceding it were marred by the tabloid spectacle of murder accusations, casting a pall over the final exit of a man known for his dignity and grace. 5. Jimi Hendrix, 1942–1970. Jimi Hendrix is widely regarded as the greatest instrumentalist in the history of rock music. In a career that lasted only 4 years, he expanded the vocabulary of the electric guitar more than anyone before or since. His headlining set at Woodstock in 1969 and his 3 studio albums changed music forever. He was a cosmic traveler, a sonic innovator who seemed to exist on a different plane of reality. Hendrix died of asphyxia due to barbiturate intoxication on September 18, 1970, in London. He was 27 years old. He died without a will, a fact that would lead to one of the longest and most bitter family feuds in music history, spanning decades and involving the movement of his actual physical remains. For many years, Jimi's father, Al Hendrix, managed the estate. When Al grew old, the control of the estate, now worth hundreds of millions of dollars due to merchandising and unreleased tracks, passed to Al's adopted stepdaughter, Janie Hendrix. This infuriated Jimi's younger brother, Leon Hendrix. Leon was effectively cut out of the family fortune. He sued, arguing that Janie had manipulated their father into writing him out of the will. The court battles were fierce, with Janie spending millions of estate dollars to defend her control against Leon. But the most macabre aspect of this legal chaos concerned Jimi's grave. For decades, Jimi was buried in a simple, modest plot in Greenwood Memorial Park in Renton, Washington, alongside his mother. Fans would visit, often leaving drug paraphernalia or trampling the neighboring graves. In the late 1990s, Al and Janie announced plans to move Jimi's body to a new massive memorial in a different part of the cemetery. This was not just a reburial, it was a construction project. The new site featured a granite dome, marble pillars, and a life-size bronze statue of Jimi. Leon and many fans were outraged, arguing that the ostentatious tomb was contrary to Jimi's humble nature and was merely a tourist attraction designed to monetize his corpse. Legal threats flew, but the project proceeded. In 2002, Jimi's body, along with the remains of his father and grandmother, was disinterred and moved to the new memorial. The legal fighting between Janie and Leon continued well into the 21st century, a sad coda to the life of a musician who sang about castles made of sand slipping into the sea, only to have his own family build a castle of granite over his bones. 4. Bob Marley, 1945–1981. Bob Marley was more than a musician. He was a spiritual and political icon. He brought reggae to the world and preached a message of one love, peace, and resistance against oppression. A devout Rastafarian, he lived by a code that eschewed many Western conventions. This belief system, however, led directly to the chaos that followed his death. Marley died of cancer on May 11, 1981, in Miami. He was 36. He had no will. According to his attorney and friends, Marley refused to write a will because Rastafarianism views the preparation of a will as an admission that death is inevitable and final, whereas Rastas believe in life everlasting. Because he died intestate, his estate was supposed to be divided according to Jamaican law. 10% to his widow, Rita Marley, for life, and the rest divided equally among his children. But Marley had many children. 11 acknowledged, though some sources suggest more, with several different women. The potential for conflict was enormous. The legal chaos that ensued is legendary. It is estimated that the legal battles over the Marley estate consumed more than $30 million in legal fees and lasted for more than 30 years. The most scandalous chapter involved Rita Marley herself. In the years following Bob's death, it was alleged that Rita and her lawyers forged Bob's signature on documents dated prior to his death to transfer the ownership of corporate assets to her, bypassing the strict intestacy laws. In a landmark legal ruling, the fraud was exposed. The administrators of the estate sued Rita, and she was removed as an executor, though she retained her share as a widow. The estate was in such disarray that the rights to Marley's music and image were almost sold to outside investors. It took decades for the family to consolidate control and stop the infighting. Marley is buried in a mausoleum in 9 Mile, Jamaica, his birthplace. He was buried with his Gibson Les Paul guitar, a soccer ball, a cannabis bud, and a Bible. While he rests in peace, his legacy was a war zone of copyright claims, paternity suits, and fraud allegations. Proving that money is the root of all evil was a lesson his estate learned the hard way. 3. Prince, 1958-2016. Prince Rogers Nelson was a musical prodigy who played 27 instruments on his debut album. He was a prolific genius who fought fiercely for control of his art, famously writing "slave" on his cheek during a dispute with Warner Brothers. He was known for his privacy and his meticulous control over his image and his master recordings. When Prince died of an accidental fentanyl overdose on April 21, 2016, at his Paisley Park estate in Minnesota, he left behind a vault filled with thousands of unreleased songs, a massive fortune, and, shockingly, no will. The absence of a will for a man who was so controlling of his business affairs was baffling. Because he had no spouse and no children, his estate fell to his 6 siblings, 1 full sister and 5 half-siblings. Under Minnesota law, they were all equal heirs. This triggered immediate chaos. A bank, Comerica, was appointed to manage the estate, but the siblings could rarely agree on anything. They split into factions, hired different lawyers, and fought over how to monetize Prince's legacy. But the biggest legal battle was not between the siblings, it was with the United States government. The IRS and the estate entered into a high-stakes valuation dispute. The estate administrators valued Prince's assets at roughly $82 million. The IRS conducted its own audit and valued the estate at $163 million. The difference was staggering. The IRS demanded an additional $32 million in taxes plus a $6 million penalty for inaccuracy. The dispute hinged on the value of intangible assets, the rights to his music, and specifically the value of Prince's image and likeness. It took 6 years to settle. In January 2022, they finally agreed on a value of $156 million. Prince's ashes are kept in a custom-made urn shaped like Paisley Park, famously placed in the atrium of the complex for a time. But the vault he guarded so jealously was cracked open by the courts, and the decisions about his unreleased music were made by a committee of bankers and squabbling heirs, the exact scenario Prince spent his life trying to avoid. 2. Aretha Franklin, 1942-2018. Aretha Franklin was the Queen of Soul. Her voice was a national treasure, declared a natural resource by the state of Michigan. From Respect to You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman, she defined the sound of the female voice in the 20th century. She was a private woman who demanded respect in all business dealings, often demanding payment in cash before stepping on stage. When she died of pancreatic cancer on August 16, 2018, it was initially believed that she, like Prince, had died without a will. Her 4 sons, Clarence, Edward, Ted White II, and Kakoff, gathered to mourn, expecting a standard division of assets under Michigan law. Months later, the story took a bizarre turn. Aretha's niece found handwritten documents in the singer's Detroit home. One was found in a locked cabinet dated 2010. Another, dated 2014, was found stuffed under a cushion on the sofa. These were not formal legal documents prepared by high-priced lawyers. They were scribbled on spiral notebooks, full of scratch-outs, arrows, and notes in the margins. The legal chaos that followed was a surreal battle of the wills. The 2010 document favored her son Ted White II. The 2014 couch will favored her son Kakoff, leaving him her main home. The brothers went to war. The validity of the wills was challenged. Were they drafts? Was she of sound mind? Why were they under a couch cushion? The dispute went all the way to a jury trial in July 2023. For days, jurors analyzed Aretha's handwriting and the placement of the documents. In a dramatic verdict, the jury decided that the 2014 document found in the couch was a valid legal will. Kakoff won control. Aretha is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in Detroit. Her funeral was a marathon viewing of musical tributes, but the postscript was a courtroom drama that proved the Queen of Soul managed her empire from her living room sofa, leaving a final puzzle that took a jury of her peers to solve. 1. James Brown, 1933-2006. James Brown, the godfather of soul, the hardest-working man in show business, sits at the top of this list because his death triggered a level of macabre legal chaos that is almost unmatched in history. He invented funk, influenced hip-hop, and performed with an intensity that defied human limits. When James Brown died of heart failure on Christmas Day, 2006, in Atlanta, the fight began instantly. He did have a will, but it was almost as controversial as if he hadn't. The will left the majority of his wealth to a trust to educate underprivileged children, effectively cutting out his own children and his partner, Tommy Ray Heine. The chaos involving his body is the stuff of nightmares. Because the legal battle over his estate was so vitriolic, there was a dispute over where he should be buried and who had the right to bury him. Tommy Ray Heine, who claimed to be his wife, was locked out of his home on the day he died. The estate claimed she wasn't his legal wife because she was technically still married to another man, a bigamy accusation, when she married Brown. While the lawyers argued, James Brown's body could not rest. His remains were placed in a gold casket. For more than 2 months, the body was not buried. It was moved from the funeral home to a sealed, climate-controlled room in his house in South Carolina to prevent anyone from stealing it or tampering with it for DNA samples. There were genuine fears that someone would try to snip hair or tissue to prove paternity, as dozens of people came forward claiming to be his illegitimate children. In a horrifying twist, it was reported that at one point his legs had to be severed to fit the body into the casket, a claim his daughter later denied, but which added to the ghoulish atmosphere. It took 73 days after his death for James Brown to be temporarily placed in a crypt at the home of his daughter, Deanna. The legal battle over the validity of his marriage and the copyright to his songs raged for 15 years. It wasn't until 2020 that the Supreme Court of South Carolina finally ruled that Tommy Ray Heine was indeed his legal wife. Following that settlement, the estate could finally move forward. James Brown's final wish to give his fortune to poor children was delayed for a generation and depleted by tens of millions of dollars in legal fees. The man who screamed, "I feel good," left a legacy that felt terrible for everyone involved, with his body serving as a pawn in a game of greed that lasted longer than many musical careers.